This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome to episode 124. I'm your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. First off, I want to take a minute and give a shout out to a friend of the program, Ed, listening all the way from Germany. Ed sent along a kind note and a sticker that his daughter designed based on their very own Beechcraft, and it's awesome. Thanks to Ed for being a listener, and props to your daughter, who is a very talented designer, for the sticker. I have it on display in the Slick Talk studio, right alongside a cheetah, matter of fact. Well, it's not a live cheetah, however cool that would be. I'd love to have a cheetah ride shotgun with me, much like the cougar in Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby. But alas, this plastic figure will do. Why is there a cheetah? Well, a customer had a good bit of fun with our sample instructions, which, if you aren't familiar, they do carry a good bit of humor courtesy of the author, Vice President of Blackstone Laboratories, Kristen Huff. We let folks know how to send a sample, and those instructions include, but are not limited to, avoiding the Pony Express and really any animal in particular. But the customer noted that a cheetah is as fast a land animal as there is, so it's a natural courier for oil samples, and, well, that not only gave us a good chuckle, but also a nice piece of memorabilia to store in the studio. We appreciate that. Now on to today's topic, dirty data, and how it came about. One day I was scrolling on Instagram and stumbled upon an account titled, I believe it was 80s News Screens. And it's a collection of screenshots from, news programming throughout that decade. Some unnamed anchor was reporting on dirty data. I'm pretty sure it was something having to do with, technology and the pending internet boom, what have you. But as an analyst tasked with looking at samples, some of which are dirty in more ways than one. But going back a few years earlier, the true genesis, I suppose, of not merely the title, but also the subject of today's show. Back when I had started looking at used oil samples full time, I was having a conversation with another analyst about what we do and what we can analyze in a sample. This conversation centered on a customer that wasn't sure why we couldn't analyze the visible, let's just call it stuff, that was present in their sample, and yet we were able to analyze the oil. My colleague, senior analyst and programmer extraordinaire, Travis, he put it this way: analyzing the oil is one thing. Analyzing stuff that's in that sample is another. So some of you may still be wondering, what the difference is. And here's the key. If it's a petroleum-based product that you can, pour, then our machines can test it. However, taking, say, chunks of debris that reside in the sample bottle and trying to test them, well, that's a different matter entirely. Aside from filter analysis, where we remove visible metal from pleats and determine the metallurgy, we tend to stick with samples that can be run through our machines. However, that isn't to say that quote-unquote stuff, schmutz, dirt itself, things that look like dirt, sand, etc., whatever is there in addition to the oil, can play a role in the results we can obtain. It's a case-by-case basis. So while our machines are set up to analyze petroleum-based products, whatever is making that sample dirty that you can, visually see there's something amiss, something that obviously is not oil or shouldn't be there, and whether it be the fuel you're running, the ATF, so on and so forth, that can in fact relate to the results we can obtain. And in some cases, we can go a little bit deeper in analyzing the visible stuff. So I wanted to break down a few dirty samples in that they contain things that simply shouldn't be there. So without further ado, I have samples ranging from diesel fuel to gear lubes to oil from a Detroit diesel. So this is a pretty decent spread and a good reminder, let's say, of everything that we can look at here at Blackstone. So I want to kick things off with a sample of diesel fuel. This one we could tell contained quite a bit of water right off the bat. So, ordinarily you wouldn't consider water a dirty thing, but it is in fact a dirty thing when you're talking about its presence in fuel. There shouldn't be visible water. You can tell it's there by the way it separates from the fuel that's in the sample bottle with it. And in this case, we identified visible water right off the bat. However, there was also some solids. And jumping off from the initial findings, we suggested that bacteria testing would be valuable because it could help identify if that was an issue. With water, you can have bacteria in fuel. So we added on bacteria testing. So if you're not familiar, ordinarily, that's not part of the standard fuel analysis because, truth be told, it's pretty rare. So when you already know there's a problem, that's when you want to look into it. It's not something we want to charge you for when it's not likely to be a problem, especially if there's a lack of water, a lack of anything in the fuel that would present the possibility, the likelihood of bacteria. So think of this as an added data point that is particularly useful when you have things like water, solids you aren't sure about. Even an odd smell to the fuel can clue you into bacteria. So not something you will automatically need in most cases, but it can certainly be valuable as it was in this case. So we added bacteria testing, and what was visually wrong with this sample, in particular the presence of water, did in fact coincide with bacteria being present. Specifically, we were able to identify aerobic bacteria. So if you are in a situation where you are looking at your fuel and you're questioning its condition, whether or not it's serviceable, and you want to go beyond the visual characteristics, we can do that. Now we're going to switch gears to another fuel sample. This one certainly a little less complicated in terms of how it was dirty and what our recommendation was. If you listen back to episode 123 with Justin, we talked about diesel fuel testing quite a bit, what the ideal fuel sample would be and how it should be clear. It should not have particulates. You shouldn't be able to see anything but fuel. You don't want to see water. You also don't want to see any visible specks of debris. There are fuel filters that exist, obviously. However, when you have visible debris, it can cause filter issues. It's hard to say on our end just how much it's going to take to cause issues with your filter and what you're running, but the fact is, fuel should be clear. That is something that you should expect when you put it in. So identifying anything visibly in the fuel floating around, solids, black particulate is, I would say, fairly common to see specks of black debris. And it's hard to say whether or not that's related to the tank it came from, the lines. Hopefully there wasn't any issue with the extraction method when you sampled it, but it shouldn't be there. And that was the case for this particular sample I'm going to shift gears to now. We found a few black specks of what was non-ferrous debris, and that's easily determined by merely bringing a magnet up to the bottle and not seeing any movement. Now, everything else looked okay, but this sample being dirty without really the need for additional testing, this isn't a situation where bacteria was likely, so that wasn't a road we needed to go down. And we can rule out things like gasoline and there's no water and the spectral analysis is normal. All that's contained within what you will pay for with just the standard fuel analysis. However, merely finding visible particulate, anything that you can readily identify even just with the naked eye, that is an example of the data maybe being okay, but the sample's dirty and it shouldn't be in use. Fuel analysis can be very simplistic on your end. If you're looking at your own fuel and seeing stuff, it shouldn't be present. And in that case, the presence of it alone is all the data you need to know that something's wrong. Now we're going to talk about engine oil. I think what most of you expected to hear primarily on this show, but we do so much more here at Blackstone. So I like to shed a light on the things that aren't just oil, but this one's all about oil, specifically oil from a Detroit diesel that was powering a 06 Freightliner. I say was, I hope it's still on the road, but the fact is there was quite a bit of concern based on this sample. So the customer themselves, they identified visible metal when they took the sample. However, with the naked eye, you can only tell so much about metal content. I talked just earlier about how you can determine whether it's ferrous or not with a magnet, but even if you're able to identify ferrous debris being present, you won't be able to determine on your own without a painfully thorough process of removing all the visible metal, then applying, say, hydrochloric acid to see if any dissolves to find out there's aluminum. All of that's going quite a bit beyond what we would expect most owners to do. So here is where sending in a sample after you identify visible metal can lend quite a bit of insight, because while we did detect ferrous debris in the oil, there was quite a bit more going on that warranted concern. In this case, we found larger flakes that were also non-ferrous, and again, we can't send flakes through a spectrometer and expect it to obtain the metallurgy. However, in parts per million, the size that all engines make, whether they're healthy or not, there was also quite a bit of aluminum, chrome, lead, and tin. So right away, the customer is able to go far beyond what they can determine just from a visual standpoint and, bringing a magnet to the drain. Now they're aware of pistons wearing heavily, the rings, as well as the bearings. Other brass bronze parts, such as bushings, could be a source of copper and tin as well. So a visual inspection is always a good idea. You can determine that there are issues on that end, but it often is incomplete. So without the benefit of this analysis, a customer would be within their rights to assume, oh, well, I only saw a visible metal that reacted to a magnet, so I suppose this means I definitely have a problem with, the cam and followers. But going deeper into the levels on a part per million basis can lend quite a bit more insight. So often it's tempting to stop at what looks visually amiss, but what can be dirty, what can be problematic, can often go far beyond what you can determine visually. Next up, and lastly, we're going to go quite a bit of ways from engine oil, talking about a sample of Mobil SHC 629. So this is specifically from a vibrating screen, a Deister screen to be specific. And this is one that looked like it had a problem. So the sample itself did not look good. Dirty is certainly a characteristic to lend to this one. And along with its visual appearance, there were a lot of large ferrous flakes in the sample. In this case, this is a sample that only had 10 hours on it, yet had already accumulated a lot of visible metal as well as levels that were concerning on a part per million basis. In some cases, especially on the industrial side, there can be visible metals, albeit not necessarily with Deisters so much in the sense that, we don't anticipate it. But in other systems where, for example, there can be like magnetic drain plugs in place, sometimes they're in place for a long time, and then they can accumulate, magnetic ferrous debris. And sometimes that just means a drain plug needs to be cleaned or replaced. However, in this case, it looked like the screen had a definite issue. Also, what can constitute a dirty sample from a Deister is dirt itself, which is something that we can identify in the form of silicon. Sometimes you'll even find aluminum as an indicator of abrasive contamination in that particular system as well. So when we're looking at, just about any industrial application and seeing what appears to be not only visible metal, but levels that are high, compared to trends or this particular, unit's reputation, how we expect it to wear. Sometimes we'll take into account situations where, sample contamination is a possibility. Maybe it's even likely for that particular environment the system is operating in. However, when we're looking at a sudden shift from how a unit particularly wears, and we've ruled out possibilities of, sample contamination, it's likely that there's a problem generating that visible metal as well as what we're finding on a microscopic basis. And now I'll leave you with this. Obviously, what can constitute a dirty sample can vary depending on your experience, what you expect, maybe what you think is fine. There's bound to be many instances where perhaps our standards don't align, with some expectations. Sometimes this happens with fuel, for example, where someone will send in a diesel fuel and they say, I swear I smell gasoline. And the results might not align with that. So it's important to go beyond your experience level because there are situations where what you expect might not meet the data. So before you assume that, the fuel or the oil or whatever it is you're sampling that we can test, which again, any petroleum-based product as well as coolants, fuels, even brake fluid, it's all in our wheelhouse. Before you assume that it's dirty or unserviceable, whatever you want to call it, go to the data and then make the call. Because it can surprise you as far as what can manifest in terms of parts per million, or what you see visually that's clearly a problem may not be the only thing that's going on. That's where the data comes in, and going to those numbers can really help you identify whether or not there's something dirty, something bad, something wrong with what it is you're running. Thanks so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back soon with 125. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.